A virgin at 18, raised in silence within a closed convent. She woke up next to a dangerous millionaire, her body marked by pleasure and pain. If you like love and romance stories, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave your comment saying where you're listening from. The silence of St. Teresa's convent had always been broken only by the echo of hurried footsteps on cold marble and the constant murmur of prayers. Eve had grown up believing that this was the only possible world for her, a place where windows remained closed, mirrors were forbidden, and her every gesture was watched with the intensity of someone protecting a deadly secret. The nuns wore habits so dark they seemed to absorb light, and Mother Superior Helen, the woman who showed the most rigor in her education, had eyes that never revealed compassion, only constant and almost desperate vigilance. For 18 years, Eve had learned to suppress every impulse, every curiosity, every trace of desire. Her body was kept covered, her mind occupied with endless prayers, and her soul molded for absolute obedience. But there was something the nuns couldn't control: dreams. Every night Eve was visited by visions that left her awake with her heart racing and her skin on fire. She dreamed of male hands traveling across her body, of amber eyes that stared at her with an intensity that made her tremble, of a deep voice whispering her name in a way no nun had ever pronounced. On the day of her 18th birthday, when she officially completed the cycle of seclusion, Mother Superior Helen called her for a private ceremony. It was the first time Eve had entered the Superior's reserved room, a somber environment decorated with ancient crucifixes and candles that flickered, creating dancing shadows on the walls. Helen held an ornate silver cup and a small locket that Eve immediately recognized. It was the same object she had carried since she was a baby, but which she had always been forbidden to open. "Today you become free, Eve," said Helen, her voice laden with an emotion she rarely displayed. "This wine will seal your liberation, and this locket can finally be yours." Her hands trembled as she handed over both objects, and Eve noticed something strange in the nun's eyes. It wasn't just severity, but fear, a deep and ancient fear. Eve held the cup, feeling the weight of the cold metal against her palms. The wine had an almost black-red color and exhaled a sweet and intense aroma that made her feel immediate vertigo. Helen watched every movement with growing anxiety, as if expecting something terrible. "Drink," she whispered, "and then open the locket. It's time for you to know who you really are." The first sip was like fire going down her throat. The second brought a feeling of lightness that made her stagger. On the third, the world began to spin. Eve tried to speak, but her tongue seemed to have forgotten how to form words. Her legs failed, and she collapsed onto the cold floor, still holding the locket against her chest. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was Helen kneeling beside her, tears streaming down her face, whispering, "Forgive me, my daughter. Forgive me for not being strong enough to protect you." When Eve woke, she immediately knew she was no longer in the convent. The air was different, laden with a woody, masculine scent that sent a shiver down her spine. She was lying in an enormous bed under white sheets that seemed made of the finest silk. Her body was naked, and she could feel a throbbing pain between her legs, accompanied by bloodstains on the sheets that confirmed her worst fears. But what frightened her most was the sensation that something fundamental had changed in her, as if a dormant part of her soul had finally awakened. He was standing before a huge window, his back to her, observing the city that stretched below. Even without seeing his face, Eve immediately knew he was the man from her dreams. The breadth of his shoulders, the way his muscles moved beneath the half-open white shirt, the way his dark hair fell upon his neck, everything was exactly as she had imagined for so many nights. When he turned, the amber eyes that stared at her confirmed all her suspicions and fears. Kyle Warren. She had seen this name in the newspapers that some nuns read in secret, always associated with scandals, shady business, a fortune built on the margins of the law. But the tabloids never managed to capture the intensity of his real presence. There was something primitive about him, something that awakened an instinct Eve didn't even know she possessed. His arms were covered with tattoos that seemed to tell stories she couldn't decipher, and there was a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, giving him an even more dangerous appearance. "You're awake," he said, his deep voice echoing through the room with an intimacy that made her shiver. There was no surprise in his tone, only a dark satisfaction. "I was beginning to worry. The sedative was stronger than I thought." Eve tried to cover herself with the sheets, but her movements were clumsy, still affected by the remnants of the drug in her system. What did you do to me?" Her voice came out as a hoarse whisper laden with fear and confusion. Kyle took a few steps toward her, and she could feel the intensity of his presence like a wave of heat. "I fulfilled an agreement," he replied, stopping at the foot of the bed. "An agreement that was made long before you were born. You were promised to me, Eve, and now you're finally where you always should have been." Kyle's words echoed in the room like a final decree, but Eve felt something inside her rebel against that statement. The initial fear was being replaced by an anger she never knew she possessed. "Promised?" she repeated, her voice gaining strength. "Nobody can promise me to anyone. I am not the property of any man." Kyle raised an eyebrow, and something that could be admiration flashed in his amber eyes. "Interesting," he murmured, crossing his arms over his chest. "The nuns did a good job trying to suppress your true nature, but it's still there, isn't it, burning beneath all that forced obedience?" Eve tried to get up, but her legs were still shaking. The feeling of vulnerability deeply irritated her. "Give me back my clothes," she demanded, pulling the sheets more firmly around her body. "And take me back to the convent now." "The convent no longer exists for you," Kyle said with a coldness that made her freeze. "And your clothes, those rags the nuns made you wear to hide what you really are, they were burned, along with everything that represented your previous life." The casual cruelty of his words hit her like a punch. Eve felt tears burning her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You're a monster," she whispered. "Yes," he agreed without hesitation. "But I'm your monster, and you need to understand that before it's too late for both of us." Kyle walked to an antique dresser and took out a black silk robe. He extended it to her, maintaining a respectful distance. "Put this on. We have a lot to talk about, and you need to be comfortable to hear what I have to tell you." Eve hesitated, but the need to cover herself overcame her resistance. She quickly took the robe, keeping the sheets as a barrier while she put it on. The silk was incredibly soft against her skin and carried the same masculine scent that permeated the entire environment, something between leather, wood, and a spice she couldn't identify. When she finally stood up, still dizzy but determined to maintain some dignity, Kyle observed her with an intensity that made her feel naked again, despite the robe. There was something in his gaze that went beyond physical desire. It was recognition, as if he was seeing something in her that she herself didn't know. "Where are we?" she asked, walking to the window for the first time. The view that revealed itself left her breathless. They were at the top of a skyscraper, and New York City stretched infinitely in all directions, a sea of lights pulsating with its own life. It was the first time she had seen the world beyond the convent walls, and the immensity made her dizzy. "My home," Kyle replied, stopping beside her. "One of my homes, to be more precise. This is where you'll stay until the time comes." "The time for what?" Kyle remained silent for a long moment, and Eve could feel the tension emanating from him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't expected. "Have you ever heard of the Archons of the Rift?" Eve shook her head negatively. "They're an ancient order, very ancient. They seek something they call the Veil, a barrier between our world and other realities. And you, Eve, are the key to opening that veil." "This is madness," she whispered, but even as she said it, some deep part of her mind recognized the truth in his words. Kyle turned to face her directly. "Your biological mother was a descendant of a very specific lineage, a lineage that dates back to the first woman who refused to submit, whom some call Lilith. The blood that flows in your veins carries a spiritual mark that the Archons need to complete a ritual they have planned for centuries." Eve felt her legs weakening again. "My mother, but Mother Superior Helen always said I was an orphan, that—" "Helen lied about many things," Kyle interrupted, "but not about loving you. She tried to protect you the only way she knew, by hiding you, by molding you to be everything you shouldn't be. But it didn't work. You were always more than they could control. Eve remembered the dreams, the strange sensations she felt during prayers, the way the candles seemed to flicker more intensely when she was present. If this is true, if I really am this key, why did you bring me here? Why didn't you deliver me directly to this order? Kyle's face hardened, and for the first time she saw something like pain in his amber eyes. Because I was hired to do it, 10 years ago. But when I saw you, he paused, running his hands through his hair. When I saw you for the first time still a child, something in me broke. I disappeared. I spent a decade trying to escape this responsibility. But they found you, Eve concluded, beginning to understand the complexity of the situation. They always find, Kyle confirmed, and now they've given me an ultimatum. Deliver you at the solstice or die. And not just me, all the people who mean something to me will die too. Eve felt an unexpected wave of compassion for this man who had taken her freedom. Then why not hand me over now and be done with it? Kyle approached her, and Eve could feel the heat emanating from his body. Because in 10 years you've become more than just a mission. You've become the only thing that makes me want to fight against my own destiny. His words carried a brutal sincerity that hit her hard. Eve looked into the amber eyes that haunted her dreams and saw in them something she recognized, the same desperate loneliness she carried. And what happens if I refuse, if I try to run? You can try, Kyle said, his voice low and intense, but wherever you go, they'll find you. And when they do, it won't be with me that you'll be. It will be with men who have no reason to protect you or treat you with kindness. The truth of his words was undeniable, but Eve refused to accept defeat. So what do you suggest? That I stay here as your prisoner until it's time to be sacrificed? I suggest that you let me teach you who you really are, Kyle replied. That you stop fighting against your own nature and discover the power that has always been inside you. Because it may be that the only way we can win this is if you become something they don't expect. The following days passed in a strange dance between proximity and distance. Kyle had given Eve her own room, a luxurious suite with a view of the city, but she could feel his constant presence in the penthouse, like an energy that permeated every room. He didn't force her into anything, but he also made it clear there was no escape. The doors were locked by electronic systems, the windows wouldn't open, and there were always discreet men watching the building. Eve explored every inch of her new environment, looking for answers and for an escape route. The mansion in the Tiustetsa sky was a reflection of the complex personality of her captor, luxurious but somber, modern but laden with ancient objects that seemed to carry dark stories. There was an entire library dedicated to texts about occultism, secret societies, and ancestral lineages. It was there that she began to find some answers. Lilith wasn't just a name mentioned in religious texts as the first rebellious woman. According to the books Kyle possessed, she was considered the mother of a special lineage, women who carried in their blood the ability to access elevated spiritual planes. These women, throughout history, had been feared and persecuted. Some transformed into legends about witches and sorceresses. Others simply disappeared, captured by secret orders that sought to use their powers for obscure purposes. With each page she read, Eve felt something stirring inside her, not just understanding, but recognition. The descriptions of the symptoms these women presented were too familiar. Vivid dreams, extreme sensitivity to energies around them, the ability to unconsciously influence the environment, all the things the nuns had tried to suppress in her with prayers, fasting, and penances. It was during one of these reading sessions that Kyle found her, on the 3rd day of her new life. He entered the library silently, observing her for a few minutes before she noticed his presence. Eve was so absorbed in a text about awakening rituals that she didn't notice when he approached, until she felt the heat of his body near the armchair where she was sitting. "Finding answers?" he asked, his voice laden with a tension she was learning to recognize. Eve closed the book and faced him. During these 3 days, she had had time to observe him too. Kyle wasn't just the dangerous man the press portrayed. There was a vulnerability in him that he tried to hide, moments when she caught him looking out the window with an expression of deep melancholy. And there was the way he treated her, respectful, careful, as if she were made of crystal, and he feared breaking her with a wrong touch. "Finding more questions, actually," she replied. "These books talk about rituals, about awakening, but they don't explain what really happens during the process. What exactly do the Archons want from me?" Kyle moved away, walking to the most distant shelf. His movements were always controlled, but she was learning to read the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands closed when something bothered him. They believe they can use your blood and your spiritual energy to open portals, to access knowledge and powers that were lost millennia ago. "And you believe that?" He remained silent for a long moment. "I've seen too much to doubt. My own family. My family was involved with the Archons for generations. That's how I knew about you." This was the first time he mentioned his family, and Eve felt a burning curiosity. "Your family is also part of this order?" "Was," Kyle corrected, his voice becoming harder. "My father was one of the highest-ranking Archons. He raised me to be his successor. He taught me about the rituals, about the lineages, about the power that could be obtained. But when the time came for me to prove my loyalty..." He stopped, running his hand over the scar on his eyebrow. "What happened?" Kyle turned to face her, and Eve saw a deep pain in his eyes. "They gave me a choice. Sacrifice the woman I loved in a ritual, or lose my position in the order. I chose love, and she died anyway." The weight of his revelation hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Eve felt her heart tighten for this man who had lost so much. "How did she die?" "The Archons don't accept challenges to their authority. She was killed as an example, to show me that my rebellion had consequences. And I..." He closed his fists. "I wasn't strong enough to protect her." Eve stood up and walked to him, moved by an impulse she couldn't control. "That's why you disappeared when you saw me. You didn't want to go through the same thing again." "Exactly. But they always knew where to find me. And now..." He looked at her with an intensity that made her tremble. "Now I have even more to lose." The confession was implicit in his words, and Eve felt something moving inside her, not just compassion, but something deeper and more dangerous. During these 3 days, she had tried to convince herself that she hated Kyle for taking her from her previous life. But the truth was that she felt more alive beside him than she ever had in the convent. "Is there any way to beat them?" she asked, knowing she was crossing a line by asking this question. It was no longer about escaping. It was about fighting. Kyle studied her for a long moment. "Maybe. But it would be dangerous, and it would require you to fully embrace what you are." "What do you mean?" He approached her until he was so close that she could feel his breath. "The Archons expect to receive you as a passive victim. They're counting on the fact that you were raised to be submissive, obedient, but if you fully awakened your powers before the ritual, if you became something they can't control..." Eve felt a shiver run down her spine. "You're talking about transforming me into the very thing they fear." "I'm talking about you becoming who you were always destined to be," Kyle corrected. "But that would mean abandoning everything the nuns taught you about being good and pure. It would mean accepting parts of yourself that might be dark, dangerous." Eve looked into the amber eyes that had haunted her for so long and made a decision that would change everything. "Teach me." Kyle's reaction was immediate and intense. His eyes darkened, and she could see desire fighting against caution in his face. "Eve, you don't understand what you're asking. The awakening process, it's intimate, it's intense, and once we start, there's no going back." "I don't want to go back," she replied, and realized she was speaking the truth. "I want power, I want choice, and I want you to help me achieve both." Kyle extended his hand to her, hesitant. "If we do this, everything changes between us. You understand that?" Eve looked at the offered hand, strong, marked by scars, but also capable of a gentleness she was beginning to crave. "Maybe it's time to change." When she placed her hand in his, she felt an electric current run through her entire body, and by Kyle's eyes, she knew he had felt the same thing. The awakening had begun, and there was no turning back for either of them. The training began the next morning, but not in the way Eve expected. Kyle took her to a room she hadn't discovered before, a circular chamber in the center of the penthouse, completely empty except for symbols engraved on the black marble floor. The walls were covered with mirrors, and she saw herself reflected infinitely, as if there were 1,000 versions of herself watching. "The first step is for you to stop fighting against yourself," Kyle said, his voice echoing strangely in the environment. He had exchanged the suits she knew him for simpler clothes, black pants and a t-shirt that completely revealed the tattoos covering his arms. She noticed that many of the symbols were similar to those engraved on the floor. "I don't understand," Eve replied, uncomfortable with the intensity of the mirrors around her. "You spent 18 years learning to suppress every impulse, every emotion, every desire. To awaken your powers, you need to do exactly the opposite." Kyle walked until he was behind her, so close that she could feel the heat emanating from his body. "You need to feel everything." Eve observed her reflection in the mirrors and saw a woman who still seemed foreign to herself. Her loose hair fell in waves over her shoulders. Her skin had gained a healthier tone away from the cold walls of the convent, and there was something different in her eyes, an intensity that wasn't there before. "How do I do that?" she asked. "By closing your eyes," Kyle whispered very close to her ear, "and letting me touch you." The request made her tremble. During the last few days, they had maintained a careful distance, but now Eve could feel the sexual tension that existed between them like an electric current in the air. "Kyle." "Trust me," he said, his hands hovering over her shoulders without touching her yet. "I won't hurt you, but you need to learn to feel without fear, to desire without guilt. That's how your power works, through emotional intensity." Eve closed her eyes and tried to relax. When Kyle's hands finally rested on her shoulders, she felt a wave of heat run through her entire body. It was different from any touch she had ever experienced, not just physical but energetic, as if he were awakening dormant parts of her soul. "Feel," he murmured, his hands slowly descending down her arms. "Don't analyze, don't judge, just allow the sensations to exist." As he continued touching her, always respectful but increasingly intimate, Eve began to feel something moving inside her. Not just physical desire, but something deeper, an energy that seemed to want to expand beyond the limits of her body. And when she opened her eyes, she saw something impossible. The candles around the room had lit themselves. "Is that normal?" she asked, her voice coming out huskier than expected. "For you, yes," Kyle replied, but there was a tension in his voice that worried her. "You're responding faster than I expected. This is powerful." During the weeks that followed, the training intensified. Kyle taught her to meditate, to channel her emotions, to use her energy to influence small objects around her. But the hardest thing for Eve was learning to accept the darker aspects of herself. There was an ancient anger inside her, anger for lost opportunities, for stolen freedom, for choices she never got to make. And Kyle encouraged her to embrace that anger. "Anger is not your enemy," he would say, as he watched her make a candle explode with just a look. "It's fuel, it's raw power that can be directed." But the more she learned about her powers, the more she realized that Kyle was changing too. He had become more protective, more possessive. Sometimes she caught him observing her with an intensity that went beyond the duty of an instructor. And there were moments of growing intimacy between them, hands that lingered in touch, gazes that lasted longer than necessary, a sexual tension that was becoming impossible to ignore. One night, after a particularly intense session where Eve had managed to move heavy objects just with the force of will, they were sitting in the living room, sharing a bottle of wine. The alcohol had relaxed some of the barriers both maintained, and the conversation had become more personal. "Tell me about her," Eve said suddenly. "The woman you loved." Kyle was silent for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass. "Isabel," he said finally. She also had powers, but different from yours. She could see the future, fragments of it. That's how we knew the Archons would come after her. You tried to run? For 2 years. But it's impossible to escape something when you don't know exactly what you're fighting against. Kyle took a long sip of wine. When they finally found us, they offered me a deal. If I handed her over voluntarily, she would die quickly without pain. If I resisted, they would torture her first. Eve felt her heart tighten. What did you do? I chose to protect her. I fought until the last moment, but it wasn't enough. Kyle looked at her, and Eve saw the raw pain in his eyes. They killed her right in front of me, slowly, as they promised, and they left me alive to carry the guilt. It wasn't your fault, Eve said instinctively, extending her hand to cover his. No, Kyle laughed bitterly. If I had been stronger, smarter, faster. If, Eve interrupted. You did what you could with the information and power you had at the time, but now it's different. Now you know what they're capable of doing. And now you have a partner who can fight by your side. Kyle looked at her in surprise. Partner? Eve felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but she didn't back down. I'm not Isabel. I'm not going to stand by waiting to be saved. If we're going to face the Archons, we do it together. Something changed in Kyle's face at that moment. The careful barrier he maintained between them began to dissolve. Eve, he said, his voice laden with an emotion she couldn't fully identify. What? He leaned forward, bringing his face closer to hers. You don't understand what you're doing to me. Eve's heart accelerated. Then explain it to me. I swore to myself that I would never allow myself to feel this for another person, but you... He ran his hand over her face, the touch sending waves of electricity through her skin. You're making me forget all the reasons why this is a bad idea. Eve leaned into the touch, closing her eyes. Maybe it's time for you to stop fighting against what you feel. If I do that, Kyle whispered, his lips almost touching hers, there will be no going back. You'll become mine, and I'll become yours, completely. Eve opened her eyes and faced him, directly. I'm already yours. The question is, when are you going to stop fighting against the fact that you're also mine? Kyle's answer came in the form of a kiss, intense, desperate, laden with weeks of repressed tension. And the moment their lips touched, Eve felt something explode inside her. Not just desire, but power, an energy that made all the candles in the room light simultaneously, and the mirrors vibrate with a frequency that seemed to echo in her bones. When they finally separated, both were breathless. And Eve knew she had crossed another irreversible line. She was no longer just a woman discovering her powers. She was becoming something new, something dangerous. And Kyle was no longer just her protector or instructor. He was hers, and she was his. And together they were about to become something that not even the Archons expected. After that night, something fundamental changed between them. Kyle no longer maintained distance, and Eve discovered that physical intimacy drastically intensified her powers. Each touch, each kiss, each moment of proximity made her spiritual energy grow exponentially. It was as if she were finally accessing parts of herself that had been locked away all her life. But with power also came a thirst for answers. The locket she had carried since childhood still remained closed, and Eve felt that it held fundamental secrets about her origin. One morning, 3 weeks after the beginning of her training, she decided to confront Kyle about it. Do you know how to open this? She asked, showing the small ornate medallion that never left her neck. Kyle observed the object with a strange expression. Actually, yes, but are you sure you want to know what's inside? Some truths change everything. I'm tired of living in ignorance, Eve replied firmly. Help me open it. Kyle took her to his private office, an environment she rarely visited. The walls were covered with ancient maps, historical documents, and photographs that seemed to date from decades ago. He removed a small ornate key from a locked drawer and handed it to her. This key has belonged to my family for generations. The Warrens have always been guardians of Archon's secrets, even when we tried to distance ourselves from them. His hands trembled slightly as he handed her the key. "My father told me that one day I would need to use it to help the last descendant of Lilith. I never thought it would be you." Eve inserted the key into the locket with trembling hands. When it opened, it revealed not just a secret compartment, but a small yellowed photograph. The woman in the image was young, beautiful, and wore a nun's habit. But what left Eve breathless was realizing she was looking at her own face. The same eyes, the same bone structure, the same dark hair. "Mother Superior Helen," she whispered, finally recognizing the woman who had been harshest with her during all those years. "Your mother," Kyle confirmed softly. Helen Morris fell in love with one of the most powerful archons of the time, a man named Daniel Sullivan. When she discovered she was pregnant, she tried to flee the order, but they found her. Eve felt as if the floor was disappearing beneath her feet. "Helen, my mother. She hated me. She was the most severe with me, the one who punished me. The most." "She loved you too much," Kyle explained. "Helen knew you carried immense power, and she believed that if she made you despise your own nature, perhaps the Archons would never be able to fully awaken your powers. She sacrificed her relationship with you to try to protect you." Tears ran down Eve's face as she processed this revelation. "And my father? Daniel Sullivan?" Kyle's face hardened. "He's still alive. In fact, he's the current leader of the Archons of the Rift, and he knows exactly where you are." "What do you mean?" Kyle ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she had learned to recognize when he was extremely tense. "Eve, you need to know something about our situation. Daniel always knew I would end up bringing you to him. In fact, he planned it from the beginning." "You're saying that all of this was planned? Our meeting, my training, even—" She stopped, not wanting to verbalize the next word. "Our relationship wasn't planned," Kyle said quickly. "That caught everyone by surprise, especially Daniel. But yes, my original mission was to find you, awaken your powers, and deliver you to him at the right time." Eve felt a familiar anger, burning in her chest, but this time it was directed. "So I never had a choice, neither in the convent nor here. I was always just a piece in a game that other people were playing." "You have a choice now," Kyle said, approaching her. "That's the point. Daniel expected to receive an obedient and frightened girl. Instead, you've become a powerful woman who can rival any Archon. That changes everything." Eve looked again at the photograph of her mother. Helen looked so young, so hopeful. What happened to her after I was born? "She made a deal with the Archons. She promised to raise you in the convent, to mold you to be submissive in exchange for her own life, and she fulfilled her part of the deal as far as she could. Is she still alive?" Kyle's hesitation was answer enough. "Daniel killed her the same night you were brought here. He said the agreement had been fulfilled and Helen was no longer necessary." The pain Eve felt was like a dagger piercing her chest. Helen had spent 18 years protecting her in the only way she knew, sacrificing any chance of having a true relationship with her daughter, and in the end, she had lost her life anyway. "I'm going to kill him," she said, and her voice carried a cold determination that made Kyle take a step back. "Eve?" "No," she interrupted, and Kyle could see dark energy manifesting around her. The candles in the room flickered, papers flew from the tables, and the ambient temperature dropped several degrees. "He killed my mother. He destroyed my life before it even began. And now he expects me to docilely surrender myself so he can use my power for his own ends." "That's exactly what he expects," said a familiar voice from the office door. Both turned to see Helen standing at the entrance, not the elderly and severe Helen that Eve knew, but the young woman from the photograph. She seemed translucent, as if made of moonlight and memories. "Mother?" Eve whispered, barely able to believe what she was seeing. "My dear daughter," Helen said, her voice echoing with an ethereal quality. "You've grown and become everything I hoped and feared at the same time." "You're dead," Eve stated, tears returning to her eyes. "My body is dead," Helen confirmed. "But part of me remained connected to you through the locket. I promised myself that I would protect you until you were strong enough to protect yourself." Kyle observed the scene in silence, clearly disturbed by the spiritual manifestation. "How is this possible?" Helen smiled sadly. "The blood of Lilith carries many powers, including the ability to maintain connections beyond death. But my time is running out. Daniel has discovered how to break these bonds, and soon I will no longer be able to appear to Eve." "Then tell me what I need to know," Eve said urgently. "How can I defeat him?" "The ritual he plans requires your consent," Helen explained, "but he has cards up his sleeve to obtain it. Daniel has captured people important to you, people you don't even know still exist." "What people?" Helen looked directly at Kyle. "He has Isabel." Kyle's blood froze. "That's impossible. I saw her die." "You saw an illusion die," Helen corrected. "Daniel has kept her alive all these years, using her as insurance. He knew that one day he would need a way to control you, and your love for Isabel has always been your greatest weakness." Eve felt a pang of jealousy pierce her chest, immediately followed by something much more powerful, a fierce determination to protect the man she loved, even if it meant saving him for another woman. "Where is she?" Kyle asked, his voice breaking. "Slightly." "In the same place where the ritual will take place," Helen replied. "The old monastery in Charleston where it all began. But you need to know, saving Isabel may cost Eve's life. And saving Eve may cost Isabel's life. Daniel won't let you save both." Helen's manifestation began to grow weaker, as if dissolving. "My time is up, but remember, Lilith's power wasn't just about rebellion, it was about choice. Eve, you have the power to rewrite the rules of this game, but first you need to decide what you're willing to sacrifice." When Helen completely disappeared, Eve and Kyle were left alone in the office, both processing the devastating revelations. The silence extended until Eve finally spoke. "You still love her, it wasn't a question." Kyle faced her with tormented eyes. "Eve, answer," she insisted, her voice firm despite the pain she felt. "Part of me will always love the memory of her," Kyle admitted. "But you've become my reality. You're who I choose now." Eve nodded, trying to process her own emotions. "Then let's save her, and then let's end Daniel and the Archons once and for all." The journey to Charleston was tense and laden with a dark energy that seemed to grow with each mile traveled. Kyle had mobilized resources that Eve didn't, even though he possessed armored cars, armed men, equipment that seemed straight out of a spy movie. But she knew that all that military apparatus would be useless against the type of power the Archons commanded. During the 8-hour drive, Eve spent most of the time in silence, absorbed in her own thoughts. The now open locket hung from her neck as a constant reminder of the sacrifices her mother had made. But it was the dilemma involving Isabel that disturbed her most. How could she fight to save the woman Kyle had loved first? And more importantly, how could she live with herself if she didn't? "You're very quiet," Kyle observed when they stopped at a gas station on the outskirts of Richmond. "I'm thinking," Eve replied, observing the mountainous landscape that stretched ahead. "About what your mother said, about choices and sacrifices." Kyle approached her hesitant. During the trip, he had been overly careful, as if fearing that any wrong touch or word might break the fragile alliance they had built. "Eve, I need you to know, what I feel for you is real. Isabel is part of my past, but you—" "I am your present," Eve completed. "I know, but that doesn't make things simpler, does it?" "Nothing about our situation is simple," he agreed. As they resumed their journey, Eve began to feel a change in the air around them. Not just physically, but energetically. It was as if they were approaching a vortex of ancient and dangerous power. Her abilities, which had stabilized in recent weeks, began to fluctuate again. The car windows vibrated when she was particularly tense, and she could swear she saw shadows moving in the forests they passed through. "Are you feeling this too?" she asked Kyle. "The energetic pull?" "Yes, we're entering their territory now. The monastery sits on a spiritual energy line that the Archons have used for centuries. That's why they chose that location for important rituals." "Tell me about the monastery," Kyle sighed, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. It was built in the 18th century, but the Archons bought it in the 1920s and converted it into their main sanctuary in America. Officially, it's been abandoned for decades, but beneath the original structure, they built underground chambers where they conduct their darkest rituals. Is that where Isabel is? Probably. Daniel likes to keep his most valuable cards close. When they finally arrived in Charleston, the sun was setting, bathing the mountains in golden tones that dramatically contrasted with the darkness Eve felt approaching. The colonial city, with its Baroque churches and stone streets, seemed a perfect setting for the supernatural events that were about to unfold. The monastery was on the outskirts of the city, an imposing stone structure that seemed to have been built to withstand both time and the secrets it guarded. Even from a distance, Eve could feel the sinister energy emanating from the place. It was as if the very air was charged with years of dark rituals and suffering. "How many Archons will be there?" she asked, as they observed the building through binoculars. Daniel mentioned that the inner circle has 12 members, but for a ritual of this magnitude, he probably summoned Archons from other countries too. There could be 30 or more. Eve felt a shiver run down her spine, but it wasn't from fear. It was from anticipation. For weeks, she had trained and developed powers she barely fully understood. Now finally she would have the chance to test them against real enemies. "What's the plan?" she asked. Kyle looked at her with an expression that mixed pride and concern. "Originally, I planned to enter through the underground passages I know and try to silently free Isabel. But that was before I knew what you're capable of. And now? Now I think our best chance is to do exactly what they don't expect. We enter through the front door and show them that you're not the defenseless victim they imagine." Eve smiled, and there was something fierce in her expression that made Kyle realize how much she had changed since her first days in the penthouse. "I like that plan." When night fell completely over Charleston, they began their final approach. Eve had exchanged her casual clothes for a black dress that Kyle had provided, something that seemed appropriate for both a ritual and a funeral. The fabric clung to her body like a second skin, and she could feel how the clothing amplified her connection to the dark energies around her. "Remember what we talked about controlling your anger?" Kyle asked as they walked through the abandoned gardens of the monastery. "I remember, but I also remember what you said about using my emotions as fuel." Eve stopped and turned to face him. "Kyle, I need you to know something. No matter what happens in there, no matter what choices we need to make, I don't regret anything we've experienced together." He pulled her close, kissing her with a desperate intensity. "Neither do I. But this won't be a goodbye, Eve. We're going to get through this together." "Together," she agreed, sealing the promise with another kiss. When they separated and headed to the main entrance of the monastery, Eve noticed that the massive wooden doors were open, as if they were expected. Lit candles illuminated a corridor that stretched into the darkness of the interior, creating dancing shadows on the ancient stone walls. "It's an obvious trap," Kyle observed. "Of course it is," Eve replied, but continued, walking. "They want me to enter, and I want to enter, so let's give them exactly what they want." As they penetrated the monastery, Eve began to hear voices, not normal conversations, but low and rhythmic chants that seemed to come from the stones themselves. The sound made her bones vibrate and awakened a primitive response in her blood. She could feel her powers reacting to the proximity of other magic practitioners, like animals recognizing other predators. "The underground chambers are this way," Kyle whispered, indicating a lateral passage, but Eve shook her head. "No, they're expecting us to follow that path. I say we go straight to where the energy is strongest." She pointed to a staircase that descended in a spiral to the depths of the monastery. The energy emanating from there was almost tangible, a mixture of ancient power, fear, and something she was beginning to recognize as her own bloodline. "Isabel is down there," she said with certainty. "How do you know?" "Because I can feel her desperation and her anger. She's not a passive victim, Kyle. She's been fighting against them all these years." They descended the stairs in silence, and with each step, the air became more charged. Eve could feel her, skin tingling with energy. and she noticed that her abilities were amplifying in the presence of so much concentrated power. The candles along the walls lit automatically as they passed, as if recognizing their presence. When they finally reached the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves before an ornate double door decorated with symbols that Eve now recognized from Kyle's books. But what caught her attention most was the sound coming from the other side, not just chants, but a female voice shouting in defiance. "Isabel," Kyle whispered, and Eve could hear both love and pain in his voice. "Are you ready?" she asked, placing her hands on the doors. Kyle nodded, drawing a weapon she didn't know he carried. "Make noise, Eve. Show them what you're capable of." Eve smiled, feeling a sensation of power running through her veins like lava. "With pleasure." She pushed the doors. They opened with enough force to crash against the stone walls with a boom that echoed throughout the chamber. And the moment she entered the room, all the candles in the environment exploded into flames that reached almost to the ceiling, illuminating a scene that made her pause for a moment. 30 hooded figures were arranged in a circle around a central altar, and tied to that altar was the most beautiful woman Eve had ever seen. Isabel had hair as red as fire, and green eyes that glowed with an indomitable fury. Even tied up and clearly tortured, she radiated a strength that Eve immediately respected. And in the center of it all, slowly removing the hood that covered, his face was a man that Eve instinctively recognized as her father. Daniel Sullivan was tall and imposing, with silver hair and eyes the same amber color as hers. There was a cruel beauty in his features, and when he smiled, Eve felt a chill run down her spine. "My dear daughter," he said, his voice echoing through the chamber, "you've finally come home." Daniel's voice echoed through the underground chamber, with an authority that made several of the hooded archons instinctively back away. Eve felt a complex mixture of emotions as she observed the man who was her father. There was an undeniable resemblance between them, but also a coldness in his eyes that made her shudder. This was not a man capable of paternal love. He saw in her only a tool for his obscure purposes. "Daniel," Kyle said, his voice laden with a controlled anger that Eve had rarely seen in him. "Ah, my dear Kyle," Daniel replied, his smile widening. "You did an excellent job. Better than I expected, actually. Not only did you bring my daughter, but you also completely awakened her powers. I can feel the energy emanating from her from here." Eve took a step forward, and immediately all the candles in the chamber responded, their flames dancing higher. "I didn't come here to be delivered as a gift," she declared, her voice echoing with an authority that surprised even herself. "No?" Daniel tilted his head, feigning curiosity. "Then why did you come?" "To end you and free Isabel." A low, cruel laugh escaped Daniel's lips. How noble. How predictable. He gestured to the other archons, who began to move into strategic positions around the room. "Do you really think you can challenge an order that has existed for millennia? That you can rival powers that have been cultivated for generations?" "I think you're about to find out," Eve replied, and her voice carried a confidence she didn't know she possessed. From the altar, Isabel managed to raise her head enough to face her. Her green eyes met Eve's amber ones, and for a moment there was a silent communication between the two women. Isabel wasn't asking to be saved. She was offering an alliance. "Kyle." "Isabel," said, her voice hoarse but firm, "you chose well this time." Eve saw the pain pass across Kyle's face, followed by something that seemed like resolution. "Isabel, I'm sorry. For everything." "Don't apologize," she replied. "Apologize after we've finished off these bastards." Daniel observed the exchange with evident amusement. "How touching. But you don't seem to understand the situation you find yourselves in." He raised one of his hands, and Eve immediately felt a crushing pressure on her shoulders, as if the very air was trying to force her to her knees. "You may have powers, my dear daughter, but I have experience, and I have this." He revealed an ornate dagger that glowed with its own light. Eve immediately recognized the symbols engraved on the blade. They were the same ones she was learning to decipher in Kyle's books. "The blade of subjugation," Kyle whispered, and for the first time since they had begun this journey, Eve heard real fear in his voice. "Exactly," Daniel confirmed, "forged with the blood of the first generation of Lilith's descendants. A blade that can cut not only flesh, but also spiritual bonds. A blade that can separate a soul from its powers. Permanently." Eve felt a shiver of terror run down her spine, but she refused to show weakness. "You'll have to get close enough. Got to use it first." "Oh, I don't intend to use it on you," Daniel said casually, spinning the blade in the candlelight. "At least not immediately. You see, I've discovered over the years that the best way to ensure cooperation is through appropriate incentives." He moved with surprising speed, appearing beside the altar where Isabel was tied. The blade touched her throat, and a drop of blood appeared on her pale skin. "No," Kyle shouted, taking a step forward. Ah, Daniel warned him. "One more step, and she loses much more than a drop of blood. In fact, she loses everything. That makes her special. And without her powers, well, Isabel wouldn't survive very long." Eve observed the scene, her mind working rapidly. She could feel the frustration and desperation emanating from Kyle, but she could also feel something else, Isabel's fierce strength. The woman on the altar wasn't defeated. She was waiting for the right moment. "What do you want?" Eve asked. "Buying time. Simple. You voluntarily submit to the ritual. You allow us to use your power to open the veil between worlds, and in return, both Kyle and Isabel leave here alive and free." "And if I refuse?" Daniel pressed the blade more firmly against Isabel's throat, making more blood appear. "Then she dies first, slowly. Then Kyle. And then you'll be forced to participate in the ritual anyway, but without guarantees about your own survival." Eve closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the energies around the room. There was more power in that chamber than she had ever experienced, not just hers but the combined power of all the Archons present. And there was something else, something she was beginning to recognize. "May I ask a question?" she said, opening her eyes. "Of course, dear daughter. Why did you kill my mother? Helen fulfilled her part of the agreement. She delivered me exactly as promised." A shadow passed over Daniel's face. Helen became problematic. She had developed inconvenient feelings. Inconvenient feelings? "Maternal love," he said, as if it were a disease. She began to question whether she had made the right decision. She began to ask questions about alternatives. She became a risk. Eve felt a cold anger spreading throughout her being. Not the explosive anger she had experienced during her training, but something deeper and more dangerous. "So you killed her for loving her own daughter." "I killed her because she forgot what her place was in the order of things," Daniel corrected. "Just as you're about to learn yours." "No," Eve said simply. "I think you're the one who's going to learn a lesson today." The change in the atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. The flames of all the candles in the chamber turned blue, projecting strange shadows on the stone walls. The temperature dropped several degrees, and several of the Archons began to murmur nervously among themselves. "Interesting," Daniel observed. "But light tricks won't—" He stopped speaking when he realized it wasn't just the candles that had changed. The very air around Eve was moving, creating currents that made her hair dance as if she were underwater. And her eyes had become completely white, without visible pupil or iris. "Kyle," she said, but her voice sounded different, deeper, echoing as if coming from several throats simultaneously. "Trust me." Without hesitation, Kyle nodded. "Always." Eve smiled, and when she did, everyone in the room saw something that made them instinctively back away. Her teeth had become sharp as blades, and there was a sinister light emanating from her mouth. "Isabel," she called, her supernatural voice echoing through the stones. "Are you ready for revenge?" "For 10 years," Isabel replied, and her own voice was changing, becoming stronger as she spoke. "Then let's end this." What happened next was as if Eve had released a storm that had been contained for 18 years. Pure energy exploded from her in concentric waves, and the first impact was so powerful that several of the Archons were thrown against the walls. The ropes binding Isabel disintegrated instantly, freeing her. Daniel tried to maintain control of the situation, shouting orders to the other Archons, but his voice was drowned out by the growing sound emanating from Eve, something between a roar and a chant that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. "Impossible," he murmured, watching his daughter transform into something that was beyond his comprehension or control. "Not impossible," Eve corrected, her voice echoing, with the power of generations of women who had been silenced. "Inevitable. You spent so much time trying to control our power that you forgot to consider what would happen if we decided to stop fighting against ourselves." Isabel rose from the altar, her own powers manifesting for the first time in a decade. Golden. Lights danced around her fists, and when she looked at Daniel, there was death in her green eyes. 10 years, she repeated. 10 years of torture, of being used as bait, of being kept alive only to serve your purposes. She took a step toward him, and each step made the floor tremble. "I think it's time for you to pay for that." Daniel finally realized that he had completely lost control of the situation. "Retreat!" he shouted to the other Archons. "Activate the defenses! Bring the reinforcements!" But it was too late. Eve and Isabel, working in perfect sync, had become something that none of the Archons were prepared to face. And Kyle, watching the two women he loved fighting side by side, knew he was witnessing the beginning of a new era. What followed was less a battle and more a supernatural storm that completely transformed the underground chamber. Eve and Isabel moved like forces of nature, their combined powers creating a spectacle of light and shadow that made the very stones of the monastery groan under the pressure. The Archons, accustomed to being the predators in these situations, found themselves being hunted by something much older and more powerful than their centuries-old traditions. Daniel tried to organize a defense, brandishing the blade of subjugation, as if it were a talisman against the chaos spreading around him. But the weapon that was supposed to drain spiritual powers seemed useless against the raw energy Eve was channeling. It was like trying to cut a hurricane with a knife. "This isn't possible," he shouted over the supernatural roar that filled the air. "You're just two women. We are an ancient order." "And that was always your weakness," Isabel replied, her red hair floating like living flames around her face. "You never understood that it's not about age or tradition. It's about pure will." She extended her hands toward a group of Archons who were trying to flank them, and golden beams of energy exploded from her palms, sending them flying against the walls with enough force to leave craters in the ancient stone. But what impressed Kyle most, observing from a strategic position where he could intervene if necessary, was the perfect synchrony between the two women. Eve had transformed into something that completely transcended the timid girl he had taken from the convent. Blue-silver energy danced around her body like living serpents, and when she gestured, entire pieces of the ceiling collapsed on the Archons. But it wasn't just raw power. There was a precision in her attacks that spoke of an ancestral wisdom awakening within her. "They're communicating telepathically," Kyle realized, seeing how Eve and Isabel perfectly anticipated each other's movements. One of the older Archons, clearly desperate, began to recite an incantation in a language Kyle recognized as archaic Latin. The air around the man began to glow with a sinister red light, and Kyle felt a malignant energy dangerously concentrating. "Eve!" he shouted a warning, but she had already sensed the threat. Turning with fluid grace, she directed both hands toward the Archon who was conjuring. What came out of her fingers wasn't just energy. It was something that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality. The man's enchantment disintegrated instantly, and he himself was enveloped by a sphere of energy that lifted him from the floor before imploding him into himself. "My God," one of the remaining Archons whispered. "She's using primordial magic. That should be impossible for someone untrained." "I had the best trainer," Eve replied, casting a meaningful look at Kyle, "and the best motivation." Daniel, seeing his order being systematically destroyed, made a desperate decision. Instead of continuing to directly attack the women, he turned to Kyle. "If I can't control them through fear," he murmured, "perhaps through pain." He moved. With superhuman speed, the blade of subjugation aiming directly at Kyle's heart. The movement was so fast that even Kyle's enhanced reflexes were almost not enough. He managed to partially dodge, but the blade opened a deep cut along his left side. The cry of pain that escaped from Kyle echoed through the chamber, and the effect on Eve was immediate and devastating. The blue-silver energy dancing around her became pure white, not the soft light of the moon, but the fierce light of an exploding star. "You don't touch him." Her voice echoed with a force that made cracks appear in the stone walls. What followed was a demonstration of power that even Isabel observed with a mixture of admiration and concern. Eve didn't just attack Daniel, she completely redrew the reality around him. The floor where he stood transformed into spiritual quicksand, trapping him in place. The air in his lungs became dense like water, making him struggle to breathe, and the blade of subjugation itself began to glow with a reddish light that was clearly causing pain in his hands. "Now you will discover," Eve said, walking slowly toward him, "what happens when someone hurts what is mine." Daniel tried to speak, but only strangled sounds came from his throat. Around him, the remaining Archons had completely stopped fighting, watching in terror as their leader was systematically destroyed by his own daughter he had hoped to use. "Eve," Isabel said softly, appearing beside her, "I can feel what you want to do to him, and he deserves it. But if you kill him like this, you'll become exactly the kind of monster he is." Eve stopped, her still completely white eyes turning to Isabel. "He killed my mother. He tortured you for 10 years. He tried to kill Kyle. And for all that he deserves punishment," Isabel agreed, "but not by your hands, not like this. You're better than him, Eve. Don't let anger transform you into what he wanted you to become." For a long moment, Eve hesitated. The power running through her begged for blood, for vengeance, for her to make Daniel pay for every moment of pain he had caused. But then she heard Kyle's voice, weak but firm, from the place where he had leaned against a wall. "Isabel is right. Love, you've already won. Don't let him take your humanity too." Slowly, very slowly, the white light around Eve began to diminish. Her eyes returned to their normal amber, and she lowered her hands. Daniel collapsed to the floor, freed from the spiritual prison, but clearly broken both physically and psychologically. "You're right," she said finally. "He's not worth me becoming a monster." Instead, she turned to the remaining Archons, who cowered under her gaze. "But that doesn't mean there won't be consequences. You have a choice. Dissolve this order immediately, free all the people you keep prisoner, and dedicate the rest of your lives to undoing the damage you've caused. Or—" She didn't need to finish the threat. The demonstration of power they had witnessed made it very clear what the alternatives were. "We agree," one of the older Archons said quickly. "The order of the Archons of the Rift is dissolved from this moment." "Excellent," Eve replied. "Isabel, can you ensure they keep their word?" Isabel smiled, and there was something both dangerous and satisfied in her expression. "It will be my pleasure. I have 10 years of knowledge about their operations. I know exactly where to find each prisoner, each stolen artifact, each dirty secret they keep." Eve nodded, then turned to Daniel, who was still on the floor, looking at her with a mixture of fear and something that could have been distorted paternal pride. "And as for you," she said, "you will live. But you will live knowing that you lost, that the daughter you tried to use as a tool became the person responsible for the destruction of everything you worked for. And if I ever discover that you tried to recreate this order or hurt innocent people again—" She leaned down to whisper something in his ear that made the man turn completely pale. "Understood?" she asked loudly. Daniel nodded vigorously, clearly too terrified to do anything but agree. Eve stood up and walked to Kyle, who was rapidly losing blood. "How are you?" "Alive," he replied, trying to smile. "And completely in love with a woman who is apparently capable of redrawing the laws of physics when she's angry." Eve laughed, the sound surprisingly normal after all the supernatural power she had displayed. "Only when someone hurts what I love." Isabel approached them, and for the first time there was a moment of real tension among the three people. Eve and Isabel looked at each other, two powerful women who had shared not just a battle, but also love for the same man. "So," Isabel said finally, "what do we do now?" The silence that followed Isabel's question weighed on the three of them like a dense cloud. The remaining Archons had been escorted out of the chamber by Kyle's men, taking Daniel with them, and now only Eve, Kyle, and Isabel remained in the ruins of what had been the most powerful sanctuary of a millennial order. Eve observed Isabel for a long moment, studying the woman who had been Kyle's first love. Even after 10 years of imprisonment and torture, Isabel radiated a strength that Eve couldn't help but admire. Her red hair was disheveled, her skin marked by scars that told a story of suffering, but there was something unbreakable in her green eyes. "You still love him," Eve said finally. It wasn't a question. Isabel smiled sadly. "I'll always love a part of him. He was my first freedom, my first true love. But 10 years change a person, Eve. I'm no longer the woman he loved." "And I'm no longer the man you loved," Kyle added, softly, struggling to stay standing despite the wound in his side. "The last 10 years broke me and rebuilt me in ways I didn't even know were possible." Isabel walked to one of the high windows of the chamber, observing the first lights of dawn filtering through the mountains of South Carolina. "When I was trapped here, alone with my thoughts during all these years, I had a lot of time to reflect on us, Kyle, on what we had and what we lost." She turned to face them. "I realized that what I miss most isn't specifically you, but the feeling of being completely seen and accepted by another person. And watching you two fight today, seeing the way you move like two parts of the same, so I recognize that. It's what I always wanted but never achieved with you." Kyle frowned. "Isabel, that's not true. We had passion," she interrupted him gently. "We had adventure. We had a real connection. But we never had what you two have. You complete each other in a way I didn't even know was possible." Eve felt a wave of relief, immediately followed by guilt for feeling relief. "Isabel, I don't want you to think that you stole him from me." Isabel laughed, but there was genuine joy in the sound. "Dear, you saved him. For 10 years. Kyle carried the guilt for my supposed death. It was slowly destroying him, but when he found you, he found a reason to fight again." She walked to the two of them, stopping right in front of them. "I can see in his eyes that he loves you in a way that goes beyond anything he felt for me. And I can see in your eyes that you love him enough to have let him go, if that's what he wanted." Eve nodded, tears threatening to fall. "I would have. If you wanted him back, if he wanted to go back to you, I would have found a way to be happy for you." "I know," Isabel said softly, "and that's exactly why I know you're the right person for him." Kyle, who had remained silent during most of the conversation, finally spoke. "Isabel, what will you do now? You always have a place in my life, but not as your lover," she completed. "I know, and honestly, Kyle, I have my own plans. 10 years being held prisoner gave me a lot of time to think about what I really want from life." She gestured to the ruins around them. "The Archons weren't the only secret order operating in the world. There are other organizations, other people being kept prisoner, other injustices that need to be corrected. I intend to use my powers and the knowledge I gained about their operations to do some real good." "That's dangerous," Kyle observed. "Less dangerous than letting these organizations operate without opposition," Isabel replied. "And besides, I've discovered that I'm very hard to kill." Eve smiled. "You're not going to do this alone, are you?" "I was hoping you'd ask," Isabel said, her eyes shining with something that could have been hope. "I know you two have your own life to build, but if you ever want to join the cause, we'll be there," Eve responded without hesitation, looking at Kyle for confirmation. He nodded immediately. "Always," he agreed. "We're a family now, in a strange and complicated way. But a family nonetheless." Isabel smiled, and for the first time since Eve had seen her, the smile was completely free of pain. "A family. I like that." They spent the next few hours organizing the practical details of the dissolution of the Archon Order. Isabel had spent years memorizing information about their operations and had a mental list of at least 50 people who needed to be freed from various facilities around the world. Kyle, with his resources and connections, could facilitate many of these rescue operations. But while they planned and organized, Eve found herself observing Kyle with a mixture of love and concern. The wound in his side was bleeding less, but she could see the pain in his movements, the paleness in his face. "We need to take care of you," she said finally, interrupting a discussion about escape routes for prisoners in Eastern Europe. "I'm fine," Kyle protested automatically. "You're not," Isabel and Eve said in unison, then looked at each other and laughed. "Definitely a family," Isabel murmured, amused. It was then that Eve made a decision that surprised even herself. "Isabel, I want to try something, but I need your help. What do you have in mind?" Eve approached Kyle, gently placing her hands over the wound in his side. "During the fight, I felt as if I could manipulate reality itself, and if I can do that destructively, maybe I can do it constructively too." "Eve, you don't know if this is safe," Kyle protested. "I don't know if doing nothing is safe," she retorted. "You're losing a lot of blood, and we're hours away from any hospital." Isabel approached, placing her own hands over Eve's. "Our powers are complementary," she observed. "Mine have always been more focused on vision and intuition. Yours are more directed toward energetic manipulation. Together, perhaps we can heal him completely," Eve finished. What followed was different from the demonstration of destructive power they had exhibited during the battle. This time, the energy that flowed between the two women was golden and warm, enveloping Kyle in a light that made him feel as if he were being bathed in sunlight. The pain in his side gradually diminished, replaced by a sensation of completeness he hadn't experienced in years. When the light finally dissipated, the wound had completely disappeared, leaving only new and healthy skin. But more than that, Kyle felt as if years of fatigue and tension had been washed from his body. "That was incredible," he whispered. "That was just the beginning," Eve said, her eyes shining with possibilities. "If we can heal, if we can use our powers to help instead of just destroy, we can change the world," Isabel completed. "Literally." Kyle looked at the two extraordinary women who had become the center of his life, each in a different way but both essential, and felt something he hadn't experienced in more than a decade, genuine hope for the future. "So," he said, pulling both into a careful embrace, "when do we start?" Eve and Isabel looked at each other over Kyle's shoulder, a silent understanding passing between them. They had begun this day as potential rivals, fighting for the attention of the same man. They were ending it as sisters by choice, united by something much more powerful than romantic competition. "Now," they answered in unison. And as the sun fully rose over the mountains of Charleston, illuminating the ruins of what had been the last bastion of a dark order, three extraordinary people began to plan how to use their unique gifts to bring light to the darkest corners of the world. 6 months later, Eve woke up on a sunny morning in New York with the sound of Kyle preparing coffee in the kitchen of the penthouse that was now truly their home. The space had been completely transformed. The somber rooms dedicated to occult studies had given way to luminous environments full of plants and art. The library still existed, but now contained as many books on gardening and sustainable architecture as texts on ancestral magic. She stretched in bed, feeling the morning energy flow smoothly through her body. Her powers had stabilized completely, becoming a natural part of who she was instead of a strange force she struggled to control. Now she could light candles with a thought, heal small wounds with a touch, and feel the emotions of people around her as a second nature. "Good morning, love," Kyle said when she appeared in the kitchen, wearing only one of his shirts. He kissed her softly, a morning ritual that never lost its magic even after all these months together. "Good morning," she murmured against his lips. "Has Isabel arrived yet?" "An hour ago. She's in the office, organizing the reports from Boston." Eve smiled. Isabel had become a force of nature in recent months, coordinating rescue operations on 5 different continents. Her base of operations was on an entire floor of Kyle's building, and she had gathered a team of people with special abilities, some rescued from organizations like the Archons, others who had discovered their powers naturally and wanted to use them for good. "How was the mission?" Eve asked, accepting the cup of coffee Kyle offered her. 17 people freed, including 3 children, he replied with satisfaction, and they managed to recover several artifacts that were being used for mind control rituals. Eve nodded, feeling a familiar wave of satisfaction. In the last 6 months, they had developed an efficient system. Isabel identified targets and coordinated operations. Kyle provided resources and logistics, and Eve served as the power of last resort when situations became particularly dangerous. Together, they had dismantled dozens of operations similar to the Archons around the world. But today was different. Today wasn't about rescues or missions. Today was about them. "Are you nervous?" Eve asked, noticing the subtle tension in Kyle's shoulders. "A little," he admitted. "It's not every day that a man marries the most powerful woman in the world." Eve laughed, the sound echoing warmly through the kitchen. "I'm not the most powerful woman in the world. I'm just a woman who discovered how to stop fighting against herself. Who happens to be able to bend reality to her will when she's determined," Kyle added with a smile. "Only when I'm protecting what I love," she corrected, kissing him again. They had decided to get married in a simple ceremony in the penthouse itself, with only Isabel as the official witness. Not because they were hiding their relationship, but because both had discovered they preferred intimate and meaningful moments to grand public displays. Isabel appeared in the kitchen an hour later, wearing an emerald green dress that highlighted her eyes and hair. She had changed a lot in recent months. The scars were still there, but now they were used as symbols of survival instead of shame. Her confidence had fully returned, and she had become a natural leader for other people who had suffered similar traumas. "The judge has arrived," she announced, "and I brought something special for you." She extended a small velvet box to Eve. "I found this during the Boston mission. I thought it would be appropriate." Eve opened the box and gasped. Inside was a delicate white gold ring with a stone that seemed to contain its own light, not a diamond, but something that pulsed softly with spiritual energy. "It's an infused moonstone," Isabel explained. "The Boston Archons were using it for rituals, but I felt it belonged to you. It responds to your type of energy." Eve put on the ring and immediately felt a sensation of completeness. The stone pulsed once, then settled into a soft and constant glow that perfectly complemented her natural aura. "It's perfect," she whispered. Kyle took his own wedding band, a simple gold ring with inscriptions in an ancient language that meant eternally bound. They had chosen the words together, researching ancient texts until they found something that perfectly captured what they felt for each other. The ceremony itself was brief but deeply emotional. The judge, a discreet man who had married several people with unusual circumstances, conducted the vows with a respectful seriousness. When it came time for Eve and Kyle to speak their own vows, both chose simple but powerful words. "Eve," Kyle said, holding her hands, "you brought me back to life when I thought I had lost everything that mattered. You taught me that true love isn't about possessing someone, but about growing together with that person. I promise to support you as you discover your full potential, to protect you when you need rest, and to love you with every part of who I am, forever." Eve felt tears running down her face as she responded. "Kyle, you were the first man who saw me as I really am, instead of how other people wanted me to be. You taught me that true strength comes from choosing who you want to be, not from accepting what others decide for you. I promise to stand by your side in every battle, to celebrate every victory with you, and to love you with all the intensity of who I have become, forever." When they kissed to seal the vows, something magical, literally, happened. The energy that had always existed between them visually manifested for the first time in the presence of another person. Golden threads of light connected their hearts, pulsing once before being absorbed into both. Isabel applauded, tears of joy streaming down her face. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The rest of the day passed in a haze of happiness. They had an intimate dinner prepared by the personal chef Kyle had hired, drank champagne while watching the sunset over New York, and danced on the veranda to the sound of soft music floating from the sound system. When Isabel finally retired, To her own apartment on the floor below, Eve and Kyle were alone for the first time as husband and wife. "How do you feel?" Kyle asked, pulling her closer as they continued dancing under the stars. "Complete," Eve responded honestly. "For the first time in my life, I feel that I'm exactly where I should be, with exactly who I should be with." "Even knowing our life will never be normal?" he asked. "That there will always be dangerous missions, people to rescue, battles to fight?" Eve smiled, her eyes shining with determination and love. "Especially knowing that. Kyle, I spent 18 years being kept in a box, being taught that my role was to be small and silent. Now I have the chance to use my gifts to really make a difference in the world, and I have the chance to do that alongside the man I love." She paused, looking into the amber eyes that had haunted her dreams for so long. "Besides, normal is overrated. I prefer extraordinary." Kyle laughed, spinning her once before pulling her back into his arms. "Extraordinary is certainly what we got." They danced until late at night, talking about future plans, the foundation they wanted to establish to help people with special abilities, the children they might one day want to have, the places they wanted to visit together. But mostly, they simply enjoyed the present moment. Two extraordinary human beings who had found in each other not just love, but true partnership. When they finally went to the bedroom, Eve stopped before the mirror where she had seen herself for the first time after leaving the convent. The woman who looked back at her was unrecognizable from the timid and repressed girl she had been. This woman had strength in her eyes, confidence in her posture, and power emanating from every pore. But more importantly, this woman had choice. "Any regrets?" Kyle asked, appearing behind her in the mirror. "Just one," Eve replied, turning to face him. "Which one?" "That it took so long for me to find you." Kyle smiled, pulling her into a kiss that promised a lifetime of moments like this. And as they kissed, surrounded by the energy of the love they had built together, Eve knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just her place in the world, but her true nature. She was no longer the convent girl who had been taught to diminish herself. She was no longer the frightened victim that Daniel had expected to receive. She was Eve Warren now, wife, partner, healer, warrior, and one of the most powerful women on the planet. But above all, she was free to choose who she wanted to be each day. And she chose to be someone who loved deeply,